Sarah Martinez had always been different from other girls in her small Texas town. While her classmates painted their nails and talked about boys, she spent her afternoons at the local gym, lifting weights and practicing martial arts. Her father, a retired Marine, had taught her that strength wasn't just about muscles. It was about mental toughness and never backing down from a fight. At 22, Sarah had just completed one of the most grueling training programs in the world. She was now officially a Navy SEAL, one of only a handful of women to ever earn the prestigious Trident pin. The training had pushed her beyond every limit she thought she had. She had crawled through mud under barbed wire, held her breath underwater until her lungs burned, and carried heavy boats over her head for miles along the beach. The other recruits had doubted her at first. Some made jokes about how a woman would never make it through Hell Week. Sarah said nothing. She just kept pushing forward, one painful step at a time. When recruits twice her size quit and rang the bell to leave the program, Sarah kept going. She proved that heart mattered more than size. After graduation, Sarah received orders to report to a special operations unit in Virginia. She packed her few belongings into her old pickup truck and drove across the country. The base was unlike anything she had seen before. Everything was classified, and the soldiers moved with a quiet confidence that spoke of serious missions and dangerous work. Her commanding officer, Lieutenant Colonel Davis, was a tough man with gray hair and scars on his hands. He looked at Sarah's file and then at her face. "Martinez, you've got an impressive record," he said. "But out here, your training is just the beginning. Real missions are different from training exercises." Sarah nodded. She understood that earning the Trident was just the first step. Now she had to prove herself in the field. Her teammates were professional but distant. They had worked together for years, and she was the newcomer who had to earn their trust. The team consisted of 6 members, including Sarah. There was Jackson, the team leader with 15 years of experience. Rodriguez was the communications expert who could speak 4 languages fluently. Thompson handled explosives and could disarm almost any bomb. Miller was their medic and could perform surgery in a tent during a firefight. Carter was their sniper, capable of hitting targets from over a mile away. For the first few weeks, Sarah's duties were mostly support roles. She organized equipment, helped with planning, and participated in training exercises. The team was preparing for a deployment to Eastern Europe, where tensions were rising between several countries. Intelligence reports suggested that terrorist groups were planning attacks on civilian targets. During a routine training exercise, Sarah noticed something the others had missed. While studying satellite photos of their target building, she spotted a small detail that could change their entire approach. She hesitated to speak up, knowing that challenging experienced operators could backfire. Finally, she raised her hand during the briefing. "Sir, I think there might be an issue with our entry plan," she said quietly. The room went silent. Jackson looked annoyed at the interruption. "What do you see, Martinez?" Lieutenant Colonel Davis asked. Sarah pointed to the satellite image. "These windows on the 3rd floor, they're different from the others. They look like they might be reinforced or bulletproof. If we go in through there like planned, we could be walking into a trap." The intelligence officer pulled up a closer image on his computer. After examining it carefully, he looked up with surprise. "She's right. Those are definitely armored windows. Our original plan would have put the team in serious danger." Jackson's expression changed from annoyance to respect. "Good catch, Martinez," he said. It was the first time he had spoken to her with genuine approval. The team spent the next 2 hours redesigning their approach based on Sarah's observation. Her attention to detail had potentially saved lives before they even deployed. Word of her sharp eyes spread quickly through the unit. A week later, Sarah received her first real mission assignment. The team would be deployed to a small European country where American diplomats were being threatened by a terrorist cell. Their job was to gather intelligence and neutralize the threat before innocent people got hurt. As Sarah checked her gear one final time, she thought about the journey that had brought her here. Growing up, she had dreamed of serving her country, but she never imagined she would be part of such an elite unit. The weight of responsibility felt heavy on her shoulders. The night before deployment, her father called. "I'm proud of you, Sarah," he said. "But remember what I taught you, stay alert. Trust your instincts and never let anyone underestimate you because you're a woman." Sarah smiled. "I won't, Dad, I promise." The next morning, the team boarded a military transport plane. As they flew toward their destination, Sarah reviewed the mission files one more time. They would be operating in a hostile environment where any mistake could be fatal. The terrorist cell they were hunting had already killed several people and showed no signs of stopping. Jackson gathered the team for a final briefing during the flight. "This is the real deal, people," he said. "We're going into a situation where the enemy knows the terrain better than we do. Stay sharp, watch each other's backs, and remember your training." Sarah felt her heartbeat quicken as the plane began its descent. Below them lay a country torn by conflict where danger lurked around every corner. She had trained for this moment for years, but nothing could fully prepare someone for their first combat mission. As the plane touched down on a remote airstrip, Sarah took a deep breath. The next few days would test everything she had learned and determine whether she truly belonged among the world's most elite warriors. She grabbed her pack and followed her teammates toward the exit, ready to face whatever challenges awaited them in the darkness beyond the aircraft door. The mission that would change everything was about to begin. The safe house was located in the old part of the city, hidden among narrow streets and aging buildings. Sarah and her team had been operating from there for 3 days, gathering intelligence on the terrorist cell known as the Red Wolves. The group had been responsible for bombing a marketplace the previous month, killing 12 innocent civilians. Sarah crouched by the window, watching the street below through night vision goggles. The city seemed quiet, but she knew that appearances could be deceiving. Somewhere out there, dangerous people were planning their next attack. Rodriguez sat at a table covered with laptops and communication equipment. His fingers moved quickly across the keyboard as he intercepted radio communications from the terrorist network. "I'm picking up increased chatter," he whispered. "Something big is happening tomorrow night." Jackson studied a map of the city, marking potential targets with a red pen. The team had identified several locations where the Red Wolves might strike next: a school, a hospital, and a government building where peace talks were scheduled to take place. "We need more information," Jackson said quietly. "Martinez, I want you and Thompson to do reconnaissance on the school. If they're planning to hurt children, we need to know about it." Sarah nodded and began checking her equipment. Thompson was already gathering his gear, including a small camera that could take pictures in complete darkness. They would have to move carefully through the city without being detected by either the police or the terrorists. At midnight, Sarah and Thompson slipped out of the safe house through a back door. They moved through the shadows like ghosts, using techniques they had learned during their advanced training. Every sound could give them away, so they communicated only through hand signals. The school was located 6 blocks away, in a residential neighborhood where families lived in small apartments above shops and restaurants. As they approached the building, Sarah noticed something unusual. A van was parked across the street with 2 men sitting inside watching the school. She tapped Thompson on the shoulder and pointed toward the van. He nodded and pulled out a small telescope to get a better look at the men. After studying them for several minutes, he turned to Sarah and made a hand signal that meant armed and dangerous. They spent the next hour moving around the school, taking pictures and looking for signs that someone had been planning an attack. Near the back entrance, Sarah found something that made her blood run cold. Fresh footprints in the dirt led to a basement window that had been jimmied open. Thompson examined the window with a small flashlight. Someone had definitely broken into the school recently. They needed to find out what was inside, but entering the building would be extremely risky. If they were caught, it could compromise the entire mission. Sarah made a decision. She squeezed through the basement window while Thompson kept watch outside. The basement was dark and smelled of cleaning supplies and old books. She moved carefully across the concrete floor, using her flashlight sparingly to avoid detection. In the corner of the basement, she found what the intruders had left behind. 3 large backpacks were hidden behind stacks of old desks and chairs. Sarah's heart pounded as she realized what she was looking at. The backpacks contained enough explosives to bring down the entire school building. She quickly took pictures of the devices with her camera, being careful not to disturb anything. The bombs were sophisticated, with digital timers that showed they were set to explode at 8:30 the next morning, exactly when children would be arriving for school. Sarah climbed back out of the basement and rejoined Thompson. They hurried back to the safe house where Jackson and the rest of the team were waiting anxiously for their report. "The school is rigged to blow," Sarah said as soon as they were inside. She showed the photographs to Jackson, who immediately contacted their commanding officer through encrypted radio. Within minutes, Lieutenant Colonel Davis was on the line from Virginia. "Good work, Martinez." His voice crackled through the radio. "We're coordinating with local authorities to evacuate the school. But we need to catch these terrorists before they strike somewhere else." The team spent the rest of the night planning their next move. Rodriguez had traced the radio communications to a warehouse on the outskirts of the city. Intelligence suggested that the Red Wolves were using it as their headquarters and weapons storage facility. As dawn approached, Sarah felt the familiar mixture of fear and excitement that came before a dangerous mission. This would be her first direct combat operation, and she knew that everything she had trained for was about to be put to the test. Jackson gathered the team around the map one final time. "We go in at 600 hours," he said. "The warehouse has 3 possible entry points. Martinez and I will take the front entrance. Rodriguez and Thompson will cover the back. Miller and Carter will provide overwatch from the building across the street." Sarah checked her weapons one last time: an assault rifle, a sidearm, flash grenades, and a knife. She had practiced with these tools thousands of times, but using them in real combat would be different from any training exercise. The warehouse district was quiet as the team moved into position. Early morning fog provided cover as they approached their target. Sarah could see armed guards patrolling the perimeter of the building, confirming that they had found the right place. Through her earpiece, she heard Carter's voice from the overwatch position. "I count 6 hostiles on the outside. Unknown number inside the building." Jackson gave the signal to begin the assault. Sarah felt time slow down as adrenaline flooded her system. Everything she had worked for had led to this moment. The door to the warehouse exploded inward as Thompson detonated a small charge. Sarah followed Jackson through the smoke, her rifle ready. Inside the warehouse, she could see terrorists scrambling for weapons and cover. The sound of gunfire filled the air as the battle began. Moving with the fluid precision of her training, Sarah advanced through the warehouse. She spotted a terrorist raising his weapon toward Jackson and fired 2 quick shots, dropping the man before he could pull the trigger. Her training had taken over and she moved without thinking, reacting to threats with deadly efficiency. The firefight lasted only minutes, but it felt like hours. When the smoke cleared, the Red Wolves had been neutralized. The team had captured several terrorists alive and discovered a large cache of weapons and explosives that would have been used in future attacks. As Sarah stood among the aftermath of her first real battle, she realized that she had crossed a line. She was no longer just a trainee or a rookie. She had proven herself in combat and saved innocent lives. But she also knew that this was only the beginning of a much larger and more dangerous mission. 2 weeks after the warehouse raid, Sarah found herself in a completely different environment. The team had been reassigned to a classified mission in the mountains of Afghanistan, where intelligence suggested that a high-value terrorist leader was hiding in a remote compound. The mountain air was thin and cold, making every breath a conscious effort. Sarah and her team had been hiking for 6 hours through treacherous terrain, carrying heavy packs filled with specialized equipment. The compound they were targeting sat on a cliff overlooking a deep valley, accessible only by a narrow mountain path. Jackson called for a rest break behind a cluster of large rocks. The team was exhausted, but they still had several miles to go before reaching their objective. Sarah took a sip of water from her canteen and studied the map showing their route. "Intel says there are at least 20 armed guards at the compound," Jackson whispered. "Our job is to get in, identify the target, and call in air support for extraction." "This isn't a capture mission, it's elimination," Sarah nodded. She had read the files on their target, a man known as Commander Khalil who had orchestrated attacks across 3 countries. He was responsible for the deaths of hundreds of innocent people, including women and children. The world would be safer with him gone. As they continued climbing, Sarah noticed that the weather was changing. Dark clouds were gathering overhead and the wind was picking up. A storm in these mountains could be deadly, especially at their altitude. "We need to move faster," she said to Jackson. "That storm is going to hit within the hour." Jackson looked at the sky and agreed. He signaled for the team to pick up the pace, even though they were already pushing their physical limits. The narrow mountain path became slippery as the first drops of rain began to fall. Within 30 minutes, they were caught in a fierce mountain storm. Rain turned to sleet and visibility dropped to almost zero. The team had to rope themselves together to avoid getting separated in the whiteout conditions. Sarah was leading the group when she felt the ground give way beneath her feet. She tumbled down a steep slope, her rope jerking tight as Jackson and the others anchored her fall. Sharp rocks tore at her equipment as she slid toward a cliff edge. "Martinez," Jackson's voice cut through the howling wind. "Can you hear me?" Sarah managed to stop her fall by grabbing onto a small tree growing from the rocks. She was hanging over a drop of several hundred feet, held only by the rope around her waist and her grip on the tree branch. "I'm okay," she called back, though her shoulder was injured from the fall. Thompson and Rodriguez worked together to pull her back up to the path, but precious time had been lost. The storm made it impossible to continue safely. Jackson made the difficult decision to take shelter in a small cave they found along the mountainside. The mission would have to be postponed until the weather cleared. Inside the cave, Miller examined Sarah's shoulder. "It's dislocated," he said. "I can put it back in place, but it's going to hurt." Sarah gritted her teeth as Miller manipulated her shoulder back into its socket. The pain was intense, but she knew she couldn't complete the mission with an injured arm. After Miller wrapped her shoulder with an elastic bandage, she tested her range of motion. "I'm good to go," she said, though Jackson could see she was still in pain. The team spent the night in the cave, taking turns keeping watch. When dawn came, the storm had passed, leaving the mountains covered in fresh snow. The weather was clear, but the snow would make their approach to the compound more difficult. They resumed their climb, moving more carefully on the slippery rocks. Sarah's shoulder ached with every movement, but she pushed through the pain. The mission was too important to let a minor injury slow them down. By afternoon, they had reached a position overlooking the terrorist compound. Through binoculars, Sarah could see guards patrolling the perimeter. The buildings were larger than expected, suggesting that more people were inside than intelligence had indicated. Rodriguez set up his communication equipment and began monitoring radio traffic from the compound. After listening for several minutes, he turned to Jackson with a concerned expression. "There's a problem," he whispered. "I'm hearing conversations about a group of hostages inside the main building. It sounds like they're holding civilian prisoners." This changed everything. The original plan had been to call in an airstrike once they confirmed the target was present. But they couldn't risk killing innocent hostages along with the terrorists. Jackson contacted their command center through encrypted satellite communication. After explaining the situation, he received new orders. The team would have to infiltrate the compound, locate the hostages, and extract them before dealing with the terrorist leader. This just became a lot more complicated, Jackson said as he gathered the team. "We're going from a surveillance mission to a full rescue operation." Sarah studied the compound through her binoculars, looking for weaknesses in the defenses. The main building had 3 entrances, but all were heavily guarded. However, she noticed something that the others had missed. "There," she said, pointing to a small window on the second floor. "That window doesn't have bars like the others. If we can get someone up there, they could provide entry for the rest of the team." Thompson looked where she was pointing. "That's at least 15 feet off the ground. How do we reach it?" Sarah smiled despite the dangerous situation. "Remember the climbing techniques we learned in advanced training? I can scale that wall if someone gives me a boost." Jackson considered the plan. It was risky, but it might be their best option for getting inside without alerting the guards. "Your shoulder?" he asked. "I can handle it," Sarah replied, though she wasn't entirely sure that was true. As darkness fell, the team moved closer to the compound. They would have one chance to get this right. If they were discovered before reaching the hostages, innocent people could die in the resulting firefight. Sarah strapped on her climbing gear and checked her weapons one final time. In a few hours, she would be scaling the wall of a terrorist stronghold, knowing that any mistake could be fatal. But she also knew that somewhere inside that building, innocent people were counting on her team to save them. The rescue mission was about to begin, and Sarah was ready to risk everything to bring those hostages home safely. At 2:09 a.m., Sarah pressed herself against the cold stone wall of the compound. Her injured shoulder throbbed, but she pushed the pain from her mind. Above her, the unbarred window represented their only chance of entering the building undetected. Jackson crouched below, his hands cupped to give her a boost. "Remember, once you're inside, you have exactly 3 minutes to get to the front door before we move," he whispered. Sarah nodded and placed her boot in Jackson's hands. Despite her shoulder injury, years of training took over as she scaled the rough stone wall. Her fingers found tiny cracks and ledges that most people would never notice. Within seconds, she had reached the window. The window was unlocked, confirming their intelligence about the compound's overconfidence in its remote location. Sarah slipped inside, finding herself in a dark storage room filled with boxes and military equipment. She moved silently through the building, using techniques learned during urban warfare training. Every step had to be calculated to avoid creaking floorboards or knocking over objects in the darkness. Through the walls, she could hear voices speaking in a language she didn't recognize. But she also heard something that made her blood run cold, the sound of someone crying. The hostages were definitely inside the building, and they were scared. Sarah reached the front entrance and carefully disabled the alarm system using skills Thompson had taught her. The electronic lock clicked open just as her watch showed 3 minutes had passed. Jackson and the rest of the team slipped inside like shadows. Now they had to locate the hostages without alerting the guards. Rodriguez pulled out a small device that could detect human heartbeats through walls. "I'm reading at least 8 people in the basement," he whispered. "Their heart rates are elevated, probably from fear." The team moved toward the basement stairs, but as they descended, Sarah heard footsteps above them. Someone was moving around on the upper floors. They would have to work quickly before the guards discovered their presence. The basement was dimly lit by a single bulb hanging from the ceiling. In a corner of the room, Sarah saw them. 6 civilians, including 2 children, tied up and huddled together. Their clothes were dirty, and their eyes showed the terror of people who had been imprisoned for days. One of the hostages, a middle-aged woman, looked up as the team approached. Sarah put a finger to her lips, signaling for silence. The woman's eyes filled with hope as she realized these were not more terrorists. Miller quickly examined the hostages while Thompson began cutting their bonds. The children, a boy and girl who couldn't have been older than 10, clung to what appeared to be their mother. They were dehydrated and weak, but alive. "We're American soldiers," Sarah whispered to the woman in English. "We're here to take you home." The woman spoke in broken English. "They said they would kill us tomorrow," she whispered back. "They are planning something terrible." Jackson's voice came through Sarah's earpiece. "Rodriguez is picking up increased radio chatter. They know something is wrong." Sarah helped the children to their feet while the rest of the team prepared to move the hostages. But as they reached the basement stairs, they heard shouting from above. The alarm had been raised. "Plan B," Jackson said grimly. "We fight our way out." The compound erupted in chaos as armed terrorists began searching for the intruders. Sarah found herself protecting the 2 children as gunfire erupted throughout the building. The little girl was crying, and the boy tried to be brave but was clearly terrified. "Stay behind me," Sarah told them. "I won't let anyone hurt you." Thompson used explosives to blow a hole in the basement wall, creating an emergency exit route. But as the hostages moved toward the opening, Sarah saw something that changed everything. A terrorist appeared at the top of the stairs, pointing an automatic weapon directly at the children. Time seemed to slow as Sarah realized she was the only thing standing between the gunman and the innocent kids. Without thinking, she threw herself in front of the children just as the terrorist opened fire. The impact of the bullets hitting her body armor knocked her backward, but she managed to return fire and drop the gunman before he could shoot again. The children were unharmed, but Sarah's protective vest had absorbed multiple rounds. She was bruised and winded, but alive. The ceramic plates in her armor had probably saved her life. "Martinez," Jackson called out. "Status report." "I'm okay," Sarah replied, though she could barely breathe. "Kids are safe." The team managed to get all the hostages through the hole in the wall, but they still had to navigate through hostile territory to reach their extraction point. Sarah carried the little girl while Thompson helped the boy, and they began the dangerous journey across the compound. Searchlights swept the area as more terrorists poured out of the buildings. Carter, positioned on a nearby hilltop, provided sniper cover as the team moved through the shadows with their precious cargo. "Extraction team is en route," Rodriguez reported through his radio. "We need to reach the landing zone in 10 minutes. The landing zone was a flat area about half a mile from the compound. Carrying the weakened hostages over rough terrain while under fire would be one of the most challenging operations Sarah had ever attempted. As they moved through the darkness, the little girl in Sarah's arms whispered, "Are you going to save us?" Sarah looked into the child's frightened eyes and made a promise she intended to keep. "Yes," she said firmly. "I'm going to get you home to your family." The sound of approaching helicopters filled the air as the extraction team arrived. But between Sarah's team and safety, armed terrorists were setting up positions to block their escape route. The final phase of the rescue mission was about to begin, and Sarah knew that the next few minutes would determine whether these innocent people lived or died. She adjusted her grip on the child and prepared for the fight of her life. Everything she had trained for, everything she believed in, came down to this moment. 8 innocent lives depended on her team's ability to overcome overwhelming odds and deliver them to safety. The battle for the landing zone was about to commence. The helicopter's rotors created a whirlwind of dust and debris as it touched down in the landing zone. Sarah could see the extraction team preparing to receive the hostages, but 20 yards of open ground separated them from safety. Those 20 yards were covered by terrorist positions on 3 sides. "We need suppressing fire," Jackson called into his radio. Within seconds, Carter's sniper rifle began picking off targets from his overwatch position. The distinctive crack of his rifle echoed across the mountainside as he systematically eliminated threats. Sarah clutched the little girl tighter as bullets whined overhead. The child had stopped crying and was now completely silent, which worried Sarah more than the tears had. Trauma could affect children in unpredictable ways. "On my signal, we move fast and low," Jackson instructed. "Martinez, you take the children first. The rest of us will cover." Sarah nodded, knowing that the children were the priority. Their parents would follow with Thompson and Miller, while Jackson and Rodriguez provided rear guard protection. "Ready?" Jackson asked. Sarah took a deep breath. "Ready? Go!" Sarah sprinted across the open ground, carrying the little girl while the boy ran beside her, holding onto her equipment belt. Bullets kicked up dirt around their feet, but Carter's covering fire was keeping most of the terrorists pinned down. They reached the helicopter just as one of the terrorist gunners managed to get a clear shot. Sarah felt a bullet graze her leg, but she didn't stop moving until both children were safely inside the aircraft. The helicopter crew chief, a seasoned sergeant, helped pull the children aboard. "You're safe now," he told them in their native language, having been briefed on the rescue mission. Sarah turned back to help with the remaining hostages. The parents were halfway across the landing zone when a rocket-propelled grenade streaked toward the helicopter. The pilot saw it coming and lifted off just enough for the rocket to pass underneath the aircraft. "We can't stay here much longer," the pilot called out. "This place is getting too hot." Thompson and Miller reached the helicopter with the adult hostages, but Jackson and Rodriguez were still pinned down by heavy fire. Sarah could see muzzle flashes from multiple positions as the terrorists concentrated their efforts on preventing the escape. "I'm going back for them," Sarah told the crew chief. "Negative," he replied. "Too dangerous." But Sarah was already moving. She grabbed extra ammunition from the helicopter and sprinted back toward her teammates. Her injured leg slowed her down, but adrenaline pushed her forward. She found Jackson and Rodriguez taking cover behind a large rock formation. Both men were wounded but still fighting. Jackson had taken a bullet in his arm, while Rodriguez was bleeding from a head wound. "What are you doing here?" Jackson demanded. "You should be on that helicopter." "Not without my team," Sarah replied, adding her rifle fire to theirs. The situation was deteriorating rapidly. More terrorists were arriving from the compound and ammunition was running low. Sarah realized they needed a distraction to break contact and reach the extraction point. "Cover me," she told Jackson, pulling out her last 2 grenades. Before Jackson could object, Sarah was moving again. She used her knowledge of the terrain to work her way around to the side of the terrorist position. It was a dangerous gamble, but it might give her teammates the chance they needed. Sarah got within throwing distance of the main terrorist position and pulled the pins on both grenades. She threw them in quick succession, then immediately started running back toward her teammates. The explosions scattered the terrorists and created enough confusion for Jackson and Rodriguez to move. All 3 of them ran toward the helicopter as the pilot prepared for immediate takeoff. They were almost to the aircraft when Sarah heard the distinct whistle of an incoming mortar round. Without thinking, she tackled Jackson and Rodriguez to the ground, just as the explosion erupted where they had been standing. The shrapnel from the mortar damaged the helicopter's tail rotor, causing it to spin dangerously. The pilot fought to maintain control as warning lights flashed throughout the cockpit. "We're losing hydraulics," he announced. "I can't keep this bird in the air much longer." Sarah, Jackson, and Rodriguez scrambled aboard the damaged aircraft as it lifted off unsteadily. The helicopter lurched and shuddered as the pilot struggled with the controls. but they were airborne and moving away from the terrorist compound. Inside the cabin, Sarah finally had a chance to check on the hostages. The children were being comforted by their parents, who spoke to them in soothing voices despite their own trauma. The family had been separated for days and was finally reunited. Miller was treating Jackson's wounded arm when the helicopter suddenly dropped several feet. The damaged rotor was getting worse, and they were still flying over hostile territory. "I'm gonna have to put her down," the pilot announced. "There's a clear area about 2 miles ahead, but it's going to be a hard landing." Sarah strapped herself in and made sure the hostages were secure. A crash landing in enemy territory with wounded teammates and civilian refugees was a nightmare scenario, but they had come too far to fail now. The helicopter touched down hard in a rocky field, bouncing several times before sliding to a stop. Everyone was shaken but alive. However, they were now stranded deep in hostile territory with limited ammunition and no immediate backup. Sarah helped evacuate the aircraft as the pilot and crew chief assessed the damage. The helicopter was completely disabled and would not fly again without major repairs. "How far to friendly territory?" Sarah asked Jackson. Jackson consulted his map and GPS device. "About 15 miles southeast," he said. "But that's 15 miles through terrain controlled by people who want to kill us." Sarah looked at the hostages, especially the 2 children who had already endured so much. They were exhausted, frightened, and barely able to walk, let alone hike 15 miles through dangerous mountains. The team would have to find another way to get everyone home safely. Sarah's mind began working through the options as she realized their most dangerous challenge was just beginning. They had rescued the hostages, but now they all had to survive long enough to reach safety. The crashed helicopter lay twisted and smoking in the mountain valley as Sarah helped the hostages gather what supplies they could carry. The pilot had suffered a concussion in the landing, and the crew chief had a broken wrist, adding to their list of wounded personnel. Jackson spread out his map on a flat rock, studying possible escape routes. "We need to avoid the main roads," he said. "The terrorists will have those covered by now." Sarah knelt beside the 2 children, who were holding hands and staying close to their parents. The little girl, who couldn't have been more than 8 years old, looked up at Sarah with trust that made her heart ache. "What are your names?" Sarah asked gently in their language, using phrases Rodriguez had taught her. "I am Amira," the girl whispered. "This is my brother Hassan." "Well, Amira and Hassan were going to take a walk through the mountains," Sarah explained. "It might be scary sometimes, but I promise I'll keep you safe." The family had been kidnapped from their village 3 weeks earlier. The parents, Dr. Rashid and his wife Fatima, were teachers who had been working with international aid organizations. The terrorists had taken them to use as bargaining chips in negotiations with the government. Rodriguez established communication with their command center, reporting their situation and requesting immediate backup. The response was not encouraging. No rescue teams could reach them for at least 12 hours due to weather conditions and hostile activity in the area. "We're on our own," Rodriguez told Jackson quietly. Sarah overheard and felt the weight of responsibility settle on her shoulders. 8 civilians, including 2 small children, were depending on her team to get them home alive. The wounded members of her own team needed medical attention that wouldn't be available until they reached safety. As they prepared to move out, Sarah noticed smoke rising from several locations around the valley. Search parties were already looking for them, and it was only a matter of time before they were discovered. "We move now," Jackson decided. "Stay together, stay quiet, and if shooting starts, everyone hits the ground immediately." The group began their trek through the rugged mountain terrain. Sarah carried extra water and medical supplies while keeping close to the children. The altitude made breathing difficult, especially for the civilians who weren't accustomed to mountain conditions. After 2 hours of hiking, Hassan collapsed from exhaustion. The boy had been trying to be brave, but his small body couldn't handle the physical demands of the journey. Sarah immediately knelt beside him, checking his pulse and breathing. "He's dehydrated and exhausted," Miller said after examining the child. "We need to rest and get some fluids into him." But Jackson was scanning the ridges around them with binoculars. "We can't stop here," he said grimly. "I count at least 3 search teams converging on our position." Sarah made a decision that would change everything. "Give me Hassan," she said, lifting the boy onto her back. "I'll carry him," Dr. Rashid protested. "You cannot carry my son for 15 miles. You are already injured." "Watch me," Sarah replied with determination that surprised even her teammates. The group continued moving, but Sarah's pace began to slow as Hassan's weight combined with her own injuries took their toll. Her shoulder burned with pain, and her wounded leg was bleeding through the bandage Miller had applied. Thompson moved up beside her. "Let me take him for a while," he offered. Sarah shook her head. "I've got him." She had made a promise to these children, and she intended to keep it no matter what it cost her. As they climbed higher into the mountains, the weather began to deteriorate again. Cold wind whipped through the peaks and dark clouds gathered overhead. Another storm would make their situation nearly impossible. Rodriguez suddenly held up his hand, signaling for everyone to stop. Through his earpiece, he was monitoring terrorist communications. His face went pale as he listened to the intercepted radio traffic. "They've called in reinforcements," he whispered to Jackson. "At least 50 fighters are being deployed to find us. They're also bringing dogs." The news hit the group like a physical blow. 50 armed terrorists with tracking dogs would be nearly impossible to evade, especially while protecting civilians and wounded team members. Sarah adjusted Hassan's position on her back and looked around at the faces of the people depending on her. She saw fear in their eyes, but also hope. They believed in her team's ability to get them home safely. "There's a village about 8 miles ahead," Dr. Rashid said quietly. "My cousin lives there. If we can reach it, he might be able to help us." Jackson studied the map. The village was in the right direction, but getting there would require crossing open ground where they would be vulnerable to detection. "It's our best option," Sarah said. "We can't outrun 50 fighters and dogs in this terrain." As if summoned by her words, the distant sound of barking echoed through the mountains. The tracking dogs had found their trail and were getting closer. The group began moving faster, pushing their physical limits as the sounds of pursuit grew louder behind them. Sarah's legs trembled under Hassan's weight, but she refused to slow down. Amira was walking beside her, holding onto Sarah's equipment belt for support. They reached a narrow ridge that overlooked a deep gorge. The only way across was a rickety wooden bridge that looked like it hadn't been maintained in years. The planks were rotted and several were missing entirely. "That bridge won't hold all of us," Thompson observed. Sarah looked at the structure and then back at the approaching search teams. They could see torchlights moving through the darkness below them. "It doesn't have to hold all of us," she said. "It just has to hold us one at a time." Jackson tested the first few planks with his weight. The wood creaked ominously, but it held. "I'll go first," he said. "If it supports me, it should support the rest of you." One by one, the group crossed the dangerous bridge. Sarah went last, still carrying Hassan on her back. Halfway across, one of the planks broke under her feet. She caught herself on the rope railings, but the sudden jolt sent shooting pain through her injured shoulder. Amira screamed as she watched Sarah nearly fall into the gorge. "Sarah!" the little girl cried out. "I'm okay," Sarah called back, though sweat was pouring down her face from the effort of holding on. She managed to pull herself up and continue across the bridge. Once everyone was safely on the other side, Thompson used explosives to destroy the bridge, buying them precious time before the terrorists could find another way across the gorge. But their troubles were far from over. The barking of the tracking dogs was getting closer, and radio chatter indicated that helicopter gunships were being deployed to join the search. Dr. Rashid pointed toward a cluster of lights in the distance. "That is the village," he said, "but we must be careful. Not everyone there can be trusted." Sarah shifted Hassan's weight on her back and started walking toward those distant lights. Behind them, the sounds of pursuit grew louder. Ahead lay an uncertain refuge where enemies might be disguised as friends. The most dangerous part of their journey was just beginning, and Sarah knew that the next few hours would determine whether any of them lived to see another dawn. But she had made a promise to 2 children, and she would keep walking until she delivered them safely home or died trying. The village appeared peaceful in the pre-dawn darkness, with small houses scattered along terraced hillsides. Smoke rose from chimneys as families prepared their morning meals, unaware that a group of desperate refugees was approaching their community. Sarah's legs could barely carry her anymore. Hassan had been unconscious on her back for the last mile, and her own injuries were taking a serious toll. Every step sent waves of pain through her wounded leg and dislocated shoulder. Dr. Rashid led them to a modest house at the edge of the village. He knocked on the door using a specific pattern, 3 short knocks, then 2 long ones. After several tense minutes, the door opened to reveal a middle-aged man with suspicious eyes. "Cousin?" the man whispered in their native language. "It is me, Omar," Dr. Rashid replied. "We need your help." Omar's eyes widened as he saw the group of injured soldiers and frightened civilians. He quickly ushered them inside, barring the door behind them. The house was small but warm, with traditional rugs covering the floors and the smell of bread baking in the kitchen. Omar's wife emerged from the back room, gasping when she saw the children. Sarah gently lowered Hassan from her back, and Miller immediately began checking his vital signs. The boy was severely dehydrated and running a fever, but he was alive. "He needs fluids and rest," Miller told Dr. Rashid. "A few more hours in those mountains and we might have lost him." Omar spoke quietly with his cousin while his wife brought water and food for the refugees. The conversation was tense, and Sarah could tell that their host was worried about the consequences of helping them. "What's the problem?" Jackson asked Dr. Rashid. "Some people in this village support the terrorists," Dr. Rashid explained. "Omar is afraid that hiding us could put his family in danger. Rodriguez was monitoring radio communications and overheard something that made his blood run cold. They're offering a reward," he announced quietly. $50,000 for information leading to our capture." $50,000 was more money than most villagers would see in a lifetime. The temptation to betray the refugees would be enormous for anyone struggling to feed their family. Sarah looked around the small room where they had taken shelter. Omar's children were sleeping in the next room, unaware that their home had become a safe house for fugitive Americans and their rescued hostages. "We can't stay here," she said to Jackson. "We're putting this family at risk." But Hassan was in no condition to travel, and the rest of the group was exhausted beyond their limits. They needed at least a few hours of rest before attempting to continue their escape. Omar returned from his whispered conversation with Dr. Rashid. "I will help you," he said in broken English. "But you must leave before sunrise. The village elder supports the terrorists and he makes his rounds every morning." Jackson checked his watch. They had less than 2 hours before sunrise. It wasn't much time, but it would have to be enough. Sarah sat beside Hassan and Amira, who had finally fallen asleep curled up together on a blanket. The children looked so peaceful that it was hard to believe they had been through such trauma. Omar's wife brought Sarah a cup of hot tea and some clean bandages for her wounds. The woman spoke no English, but her kindness transcended language barriers. She gestured for Sarah to let her examine the injured leg. As the woman cleaned and redressed Sarah's wound, she noticed something that made her stomach drop. The bandage from her leg was soaked with much more blood than she had realized. The bullet graze had reopened during their trek through the mountains. Miller saw the blood and immediately came over to examine the wound. His face was grim as he assessed the damage. "You're losing too much blood," he whispered. "You need medical attention that I can't provide here." Sarah shook her head. "I'm fine. I can make it." "No, you can't," Miller said firmly. "You've been carrying that kid for miles with a bullet wound, a dislocated shoulder, and who knows what other injuries. Your body is shutting down." Before Sarah could argue, Rodriguez held up his hand for silence. He was listening intently to his radio equipment, and his expression was alarmed. "They know we're here," he announced. "Someone in the village reported us. We have maybe 10 minutes before they surround this place." The betrayal hit the group like a physical blow. Despite Omar's willingness to help, someone else in the village had chosen the reward money over human decency. "Back door," Jackson ordered. "Everyone move now." Sarah tried to stand but stumbled as her injured leg gave out. The blood loss was affecting her balance and coordination. Miller and Thompson caught her before she fell. "I can carry Hassan," Thompson said, lifting the boy carefully. Sarah wanted to protest, but she could barely stand on her own. Her promise to protect the children would mean nothing if she collapsed and delayed their escape. The group slipped out the back door just as vehicle engines could be heard approaching the front of the house. Omar pointed toward a path that led up the hillside behind his home. "Follow that trail," he whispered urgently. "It leads to an old mine shaft where you can hide." Dr. Rashid shook his cousin's hand. "Thank you for risking your family for us." Omar nodded. "Go now. May Allah protect you all." The group began climbing the steep path as searchlights swept through the village below. Sarah leaned heavily on Rodriguez for support, fighting to stay conscious as they climbed higher into the mountains. Behind them, They could hear shouting and the sound of doors being kicked in as the terrorists searched house by house. Omar and his family would be questioned, but hopefully their story about not seeing any refugees would be believed. The mine shaft was exactly where Omar had said it would be, a dark opening in the rocky hillside that had been abandoned years earlier. The group took shelter inside, finally able to rest after their harrowing escape from the village. As Sarah sat in the darkness, holding Amira's hand while the little girl slept, she thought about how close they had all come to capture or death, but they were still alive, still free, and still moving toward safety. In a few hours, rescue helicopters would arrive at the predetermined extraction point. All they had to do was survive until then and make it to the landing zone. Sarah closed her eyes and made one final promise to herself and to the children she had sworn to protect. No matter what happened in the next few hours, no matter how much blood she lost or how much pain she endured, she would see Hassan and Amira safely home to their family. The final phase of their escape was about to begin.